Trigger warning. This story includes descriptions of prolonged isolation and emotional abuse. Well, butter my biscuit, I can still smell that faint, musty scent of cedar and old wool when I close my eyes, like a whisper from 20-odd years ago on a crisp October evening in rural Illinois. I was rocking back and forth in my favorite chair on the front porch, the skies painted pink and orange, when a memory fluttered in like a sparrow startled from its nest. Lordy, I never thought that a single, simple sound could carry so much weight. Tonight, it's that sound again, the soft click of a latch, and it's got me restless, like a story itching to tumble out of my heart. Now, sweetheart, if you're finding yourself drawn into these old recollections, why don't you do me a little favor and give that like button a gentle tap, or maybe drop a comment below. Let me know you're here with me, and if you haven't already, come on and subscribe so we can share more of these tea time tales together. See, I reckon you're wondering who I am, sitting here in the dim glow of this lamp, speaking to you through the years. I'm just an old woman, 65, if you can believe it, who spent most of her life raising her 3 babies on this very patch of land, whispering prayers at sunrise and tucking them in at dusk. But on one chilly night, nearly 7 years of my life slipped away behind a door I never dared imagine could become my prison. It all started when the sky had that heavy look of impending rain, and I heard the house quiet down, my husband's footsteps padding closer. One moment I was adjusting my shawl, the sweet taste of chamomile on my tongue, and the next, I was unceremoniously shoved into a dark, narrow closet. The latch clicked, and my world went from afternoon light to pitch-black silence in one swift heartbeat. I pressed my palms against the cold wood, tried to call out, but my voice simply swallowed itself in the darkness. You see, my children believed I'd gone to visit Aunt Martha some 20 miles north. They never once knocked on that door or peeked in the guest room that I'd left behind. And so my days turned to weeks, my weeks to months, each sunrise and sunset passing me by through the tiniest crack at the top of that old wooden door. The air was stale, but I clung to the faintest breeze that drifted in as if it carried news from the outside world. Every sound was magnified, the distant engine of a tractor, the hum of cicadas in summer, the soft thump of my heart against my ribs. In the hush, I wrote letters in my mind to my children, especially to my sweet Ellie, who was only 5, and to Jack, then just 8, and to Bear, the oldest at 12, telling them I missed their laughter, their messy hugs, and those mornings when our kitchen smelled of pancakes and syrup. Sometimes I'd whisper their names into the dark, believing they might somehow hear me. And that's where this memory comes from, the ache of my children's empty rooms, the hush that spoke louder than words, and that stubborn little hope that one day, someone would notice a missing smile at the breakfast table. So here I sit, lamp flickering, heart trembling, ready to share the story of how a gentle soul can survive the loneliest night. Stay with me, darling, because in the next chapter, I'll tell you about that first hungry night when I realized that this wasn't some terrible accident or misunderstanding. It was a choice my husband made to lock me away and teach me obedience in the darkest way imaginable. And I promise you, what comes next will surprise even the most seasoned heart. Tell me, how would you feel if you woke one morning and found your world had vanished behind a closed door? Well, butter my biscuit, I can still see that little white farmhouse sitting against the wide Illinois sky, tall sycamores swaying in the breeze like they were dancing just for me. Back then, I was barely 18, fresh-faced with a head full of dreams about teaching school and maybe one day traveling north to see the snow-covered pine forests of Michigan. I lived with my mama and daddy and 2 younger brothers in that cozy house, its parlor full of lace curtains and the smell of fresh-baked bread drifting from the kitchen stove. Morning light would creep through the kitchen window just as we all gathered around the round oak table, the ragged family Bible in the center, the hymn book beside Daddy's elbow, and Mama's soft voice would hum an old hymn as she poured hot coffee into my cup. I wore simple calico dresses and scuffed leather shoes, but I felt as bright and hopeful as a songbird each time I stepped out the front door. In those days, kindness felt like the most powerful magic in the world. I believed folks would always do right by one another. Neighbors would share a slice of pie or a jar of canned peaches without a second thought, and church picnics were the highlight of the month, with children darting between long tables piled high with potato salad and fried chicken. Summer evenings meant sitting on the wide front porch, Mama strumming her ukulele as Daddy slapped a hand on his knee in time to the beat, and the fireflies would come out to twinkle around us like little lanterns in the night air. I'd rest my head against Mama's shoulder, feeling safe and loved, my heart full of the promise that life was meant to be gentle and fair. Lordy, I never could have guessed how quickly a world built on trust and neighborly smiles could shift beneath your feet. At the time, I was courted by a young man named Frank, handsome in a quiet, steady way, with soft brown eyes and a voice that warmed me like afternoon sunlight. We'd walk the dusty lane to the train tracks, talking about the future and laughing when the horses in the pasture neighed as if they were cheering us on. I thought I understood love then, two people joining hands, promising to look out for each other no matter what. My dream was to have 3 sweet babies of my own, to fill our home with laughter and lullabies, and maybe to teach Sunday school on the side. I pictured us a happy little family, baking cinnamon rolls together on Sunday mornings and picking apples in the orchard come fall. But dreams sometimes come wrapped in shadows, and I didn't yet know that the man I trusted most could also be the one to lock the door and keep me silent. In those early days, I remember how he'd frown whenever I spoke up too boldly, how his smile would fade if I laughed at the wrong moment, and how the music on our battered record player seemed to lose its warmth when he walked into the room. I chalked it up to stress. After all, farmland could be unforgiving, and Mama used to say that men carried burdens we could never fully understand. So I'd slip him a gentle word or a cool glass of lemonade, convinced that kindness would coax him back to the man I thought he could be. I suppose I still held fast to that childhood belief that people always return, that goodness would find its way home. I'd press my fingertips to the crack in the bedroom door, listening for his voice, longing for the gentle tone he used when he called me his darling. And in those quiet moments, as the cicadas droned outside and the light through the window dappled the floor like a patchwork quilt, I dared to cling to the hope that our life was just one small misunderstanding away from being sweet again. So there I stood, dreaming of all the tomorrows we'd share, never knowing that the very next day, my world would slip into darkness behind a locked closet door, nor that the memories of those sunlit mornings and porch-side serenades would become the lifeline I'd clutch in the lonely years to come. Well, butter my biscuit, I remember the day my world tilted on its axis as plain as if it were yesterday. It was a late spring morning in '99, and the lilacs were blooming outside our front porch, filling the air with that sweet, heady scent. I just poured myself a cup of steaming coffee when the mail slot clattered, and I heard footfalls on the hardwood floor. My husband, Frank, handed me a pale blue envelope with my name written in elegant script, an oddity in itself, since bills usually came in plain white. I paused mid-sip, the warmth of the coffee seeping into my fingers, and I felt my heart flutter like a sparrow. On the envelope, in smaller print, were the words, Martha Hayes. Martha was my older sister, the one who'd always been bold and brave, first to leave home for college, first to dream bigger than our little farmhouse. I hadn't heard from her since she'd moved up to Chicago 3 years earlier, and though I'd missed her every day, life with a new marriage and the bustle of young motherhood had kept me from writing as often as I'd meant to. So when I turned the envelope over and saw her familiar loopy handwriting, I felt a tingle of excitement, like a child on Christmas morning. I slid it open right there in the kitchen, crumbs from my toast tumbling onto the tablecloth, and I read, "Dearest Beth, I hope this finds you well. Mama's not doing so great. She's not the spry woman she once was, and Daddy's health is failing too. I'm coming home next week for a visit, and I'd love for you to join us. It's been too long, and there are things we need to talk about." My chest tightened at the thought of seeing Mama's gentle smile and hearing Daddy's booming laugh again. I could almost taste Mama's homemade strawberry preserves and hear Daddy's voice reciting lines from his favorite poems. But before I could cradle the letter against my heart, Frank's expression darkened. He folded his arms, his jaw clenched, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the man looking back at me. "You're going where?" he asked, voice low, the kitchen suddenly cold. I swallowed, setting my coffee down. "To see Mama and Daddy," I said, breath catching. "Martha's coming home, and she asked me to stay a few days." There was a pause, so heavy it pressed against my ribs like a wet cloth. Then he said, "I don't think that's a good idea." I blinked, confusion swirling in my mind. "Why not?" I whispered. His eyes flicked away, and I sensed a storm brewing, something I'd never seen in him before. He muttered something about responsibilities here, about how I belong to this family now. But I felt an electric spark of indignation flare within me. I belonged to my family back home, too. I owed it to my own blood to be there when they needed me. That was my first inkling that Frank's love had limits, and that what he'd call protection might soon become a prison. Later that day, I confided in my neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, as we watched our children chase fireflies in the backyard. She was a silver-haired widow with kind eyes and a penchant for gossip, usually harmless, but that afternoon, she pressed her lips together and shook her head. "Honey," she said, "you don't reckon he's always been like this?" I shook my head, tears welling. "No, I thought it was just stress." Mrs. Jenkins patted my hand. "Just keep your wits about you, child. Sometimes a husband's jealousy can turn dark as a moonless night." That evening, as I lay awake listening to the hoot of an owl and the distant hum of the highway, I thought back to my schoolteacher, Miss Carmichael, who'd always told me that courage was born in moments like this, when a choice stands before you, as sharp and clear as a blade. My heart pounded with equal parts fear and resolve. I knew deep down that saying yes to my sister's invitation might change everything, and not necessarily for the better. But the thought of seeing Mama's gentle encouragement, of holding Daddy's hand just one more time, was a pull too strong to ignore. Little did I know then that this simple letter would unlock a chain of events leading me into the darkest corner of our own home. Yet in that trembling moment, as I folded Martha's note and tucked it into my pocket, I felt something stir deep within me, a tender spark of hope and the first taste of the fierce determination I'd need to reclaim my life. And now, dear friend, I wonder, when have you received news that promised comfort, but brought more questions than answers? Let me know down below, because sometimes it's in those unexpected moments that we discover who we truly are. Well, butter my biscuit, I never imagined the first crack in our life together would come wrapped up in something as innocent as a letter. It was a gentle spring morning when I first felt the weight of his disapproval settle into the air between us. I'd been humming softly in the kitchen, the sun dancing through the gingham curtains, when Frank appeared in the doorway holding a small stack of torn envelopes. His jaw was set so tight I thought I might see sparks flying. "What's this, Beth?" he growled, voice cold as steel, and my heart lurched in my chest. I recognized Martha's handwriting on the jagged edges of the paper, and before I could stammer an explanation, he crushed the scraps in his fist and stalked out of the room, leaving me clutching the empty air. At first, I thought it was just stress, farm work, bills, the endless chores that come with 3 growing children and an old farmhouse. But day by day, little things began to change. He started setting strict times for meals, even deciding when I could step outside to hang laundry or gather eggs from the coop. On Sunday mornings, when I'd want to attend the church service, he'd stand blocking the door as if I were some unruly child. "You belong here, Beth," he'd say, eyes hard as river stones. "Don't go wandering off." And so I stayed, voice trembling, telling myself that a good wife should trust her husband's judgment, and that maybe, just maybe, I was overreacting. But the real trouble began one humid afternoon when the sky threatened rain and I reached for my journal, my only confidant, to write out my worries. Frank saw me scribbling behind the closed pantry door, and he marched in like a sheriff on the hunt, snatched the book from my trembling hands, and ripped it in two. I stood there, tears brimming, the pages of my thoughts fluttering to the floor like wounded birds. I wanted to shout, to tell him that my words were the only way I held on to myself, but instead I bowed my head and stuffed the fragments into my apron pocket, cheeks burning with shame. Lordy, I never felt so small. My own home, once a haven of warmth and laughter, felt narrower than a coffin. I tiptoed through hallways afraid even to breathe too loudly, was ashamed of the racing of my own heart. Each time I passed a mirror, I hardly recognized the haunted woman staring back, eyes hollowed by fear, shoulders slumped beneath a weight I couldn't name. It was as if the world I'd known, the farmhouse, the porches, the open fields, had been replaced overnight by thick walls closing in from all sides. There was no one to confide in. I thought about dear Mrs. Jenkins, my neighbor whose porch had once been my sanctuary, but when I tried to whisper my troubles to her over the fence, Frank appeared as though summoned by my very heartbeat and told me to come inside. After that, I felt too frightened to reach out again. My brothers-in-law offered polite smiles when I saw them at family gatherings, but they never asked why I'd stopped coming over, and I dared not tell them. Shame kept my lips sealed as tightly as the latch that would soon fasten behind me. Inside, though, a fierce storm brewed. I was torn between the sweet memories of love I once knew, the soft brush of his hand, the mornings we'd chase baby giggles around the kitchen, and the terrible new reality of being controlled, watched at every turn. I questioned myself, was I imagining things? Was this my fault for being talkative, for daring to hope for reunion with my family? But in the dark corners of my mind, a tiny ember of defiance flickered. I may have felt small, but I was still a person with thoughts, with feelings, with a God-given right to be me. That internal battle between fear and the stubborn will to survive became the true test of my spirit. Each night I lay awake, listening to the creak of the floorboards as he settled beside me, and I vowed that I would one day reclaim the life he was erasing. And yet, every morning I would rise, knot my apron strings, and move through my days pretending everything was fine. The irony was almost cruel. I was imprisoned by a man I'd loved, forced to hide my own sorrow under a mask of cheerfulness for our children's sake. And so the first difficulties wove themselves into my routine, stolen moments of trembling hope, secret tears wiped away before breakfast, and a heart growing heavy with the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Well, butter my biscuit, I remember that day as though the very air stood still, like the clock hands froze mid-tick, and the world held its breath along with me. It was nearing dusk, the sky a bruised purple, and I had just tucked our youngest, little Ellie, into bed. I'd smoothed her curly hair and whispered, "Sleep tight, my sweet pea," before tiptoeing out to the living room. Frank was there, pacing by the window, shoulders hunched as though he carried a heavy burden. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. Something fierce and dreadful was about to happen. My heart hammered like a wild bird as I stepped closer, trying to catch his gaze. And then he spoke, voice low and trembling, "Beth, I've decided it's time." My breath hitched, and I saw it then, his eyes glinting with cold resolve, the kind I'd never seen before. "Time for what?" I whispered, the room tilting beneath me. He turned, lifted his chin, and in the next moment it all came crashing down. "You're leaving this house. Permanently." I stumbled back, the old rub catching my toes, and I shouted, "What do you mean, permanently?" But he simply reached for the keyring he'd hidden in his pocket, flashed the cold metal at me, and said, "You belong behind that door. You need to learn your place." He gestured to the narrow closet just down the hall, once my sewing nook, now transformed into my prison. I felt the color drain from my face. "Frank, no, you can't do this," I begged, voice cracking like dry twigs. But when he latched the door behind me, the click echoed through my bones like a funeral knell. I realized with a sick, sinking clarity that I was utterly alone. I pressed my palm against the wood, the rough grain digging into my skin, and I could barely draw breath as the sobs welled up. Through the tiny crack at the top, I saw the dim glow of the hallway light recede, and the world went black. In that suffocating silence, time did stop. I can still recall the first muffled sob that escaped me, a sound so foreign I almost thought it came from someone else. My heart pounded in my ears, each beat a reminder that I was alive but trapped. I lost my breath, my voice, my sense of safety all at once. I felt a fracture in my soul, as if a piece of me had been wrenched away and left behind in the hallway. What I lost in that moment was everything I had believed: the promise of love, the sanctuary of marriage, the warmth of a shared life. I realized that the man I'd trusted more than anyone could turn into the architect of my own undoing. And in that grim awakening, something inside me snapped wide open, a blend of terror and furious resolve. I wasn't just scared, I was determined. In the darkness, I pressed my forehead against the door and let tears flow freely, mourning the life I thought I had. But amid the grief, a stubborn spark flared to life, a stubborn ember of hope that said, "You're still here. You can still fight." I began to whisper my own name into the silence, like a prayer and a promise. "Beth. Beth, remember who you are." And with each breath, that ember grew stronger, heating my blood, sharpening my thoughts. By the time Frank's footsteps faded down the hall, I was no longer the timid woman who'd believed kindness alone could save her. I was a survivor awakened, primed for the battle ahead. In that crucible of fear and loss, I forged a determination that would carry me through the darkest years of my life. And though it tore me apart in that awful instant, that breaking point became the hinge on which my freedom would one day swing. So, dear friend, tell me, have you ever felt your world shatter in a single moment? How did you find the strength to carry on? Let me know below, because in our darkest hour, sharing our stories can light the way for someone else. Well, butter my biscuit, after that night the world outside my closet door seemed as hollow as an empty bird's nest. When Frank left me in that cramped space, I lost more than my freedom. I lost the familiar rhythm of my days, the comforting chorus of morning greetings, and even the simple promise of tomorrow's sunrise. At first, I sat on the cold floor with my back against the door, arms wrapped around my knees, feeling the echo of my own heartbeat bouncing against the walls. There was a peculiar stillness in that dark little chamber, as though time itself had shrunk to the size of my shallow breaths. In the days that followed, I learned to survive on the smallest scraps of light and air that crept in through the crack at the top. I mapped each shift of the sun by the sliver of glow that danced across the floorboards, and I counted the hours by the sound of a distant rooster or the faint hum of the tractor in the field. The world I once knew, porch swings at dusk, the laughter of my children echoing through the halls, Mama's soft hymns, began to fade like a half-remembered dream. I swallowed my tears and forced myself to eat the dry crackers Frank slid under the door each morning, pretending they were a feast. My faith in kindness and in people wobbled like a candle in the wind. Where had all the neighborly compassion gone? Why did no one ask why I wasn't downstairs drinking sweet tea with Mrs. Jenkins? I tried to recall the hymns I once sang in church, the ones about light overcoming darkness, but the words felt like they belonged to someone else. My prayers turned inward, quiet as a whisper. Give me strength to endure this night. Let me see the dawn. And yet, somewhere between that first tentative breath and the 7th week of confinement, something sluggish began to stir in my heart. It wasn't the bright hope of old, but a sober acceptance, a realization that I wouldn't find rescue in someone else's kindness. If I wanted to live, I'd have to resurrect the woman I'd once been, piece by piece, and fashion her into someone who could endure. I recalled my mother's words on my wedding day. "A strong heart can carry you through any storm, honey." Back then, I thought she spoke of happy storms, the soft turbulence of raising 3 babies. Now I understood she meant the fiercest tempests. Some mornings, when the corridor floor creaked with early footsteps, I'd hold my breath, convinced Frank would discover that ember of resolve flickering inside me. But the key never turned. So I let the silence wrap around me like a quilt, and I used that stillness to gather my strength. I revisited memories of who I was, a young teacher with chalk on her fingers, a wife who baked pies with oversized smiles, a mother who crooned lullabies in the midnight hush. I spoke to those versions of myself in the dark, promising I wouldn't let this cruel season be the end of my story. The days melted into weeks, and though I felt colder, stripped of gentle laughter and warm embraces, I also felt steadier. The tremor in my voice stopped rattling, my thoughts sharpened. I drafted plans in my mind, how I might slit the latch, how I'd send a message to the church, how I'd tell my children the truth when freedom came. These quiet schemes became my companions, richer than any breakfast table chatter. By the time I felt the first real warmth after a week of rain, when the sun streamed through that same crack and painted golden stripes on the floor, I recognized a new self emerging. She was scarred, yes, but unbroken, her faith in others tempered by hard wisdom, her belief in goodness now blended with caution. The empty hush that once terrified me now felt like a blank canvas, full of possibility, waiting for the touch of my own hand. So I learned to breathe again in the silence, to face each lonely hour with the steady beat of my own determination. And though my world had grown smaller, my courage grew larger still. In that pause after the storm, I found my center, and I resolved that when the door finally swung open, I would step into the light not as the frightened bride my husband had caged, but as a grandmother who knew how to survive and to thrive, even after the darkest night. Well, butter my biscuit, I'll never forget the day when a tiny sliver of light and kindness found its way back to me in that dusty old closet. It was late afternoon, and I'd spent the morning tracing my fingers over the rough wood panels, feeling the emptiness that had grown inside me. My hopes were worn thin like the frayed hem of an old apron, and I was beginning to wonder if I'd ever feel more than the hollow echo of my own breath. Then, through that narrow crack at the top of the door, I heard the faint, cheerful chatter of children playing outside, my own babies' voices, high and bright, giggling as if they didn't know the storm cloud that hung over our lives. It felt like a whisper of sunlight, stirring something deep in my heart. In that moment, I realized that even in the darkest place, life still went on, and that gave me the tiniest spark of hope. I pressed my ear to the door, letting their laughter wash over me like sweet rain after a drought. I remembered how I used to run barefoot in the grass with them, calling their names and gathering wildflowers to braid in their hair. The memory was bittersweet, but it reignited the notion that I was still a mother, still someone who could nurture and protect, even if I couldn't wrap my arms around them just yet. The next day, when Frank slid my scanty lunch under the door, I reached for the small scrap of linen I'd salvaged from my old sewing kit and began to stitch a simple star, a tiny symbol of hope, into the corner of the fabric. My fingers fumbled at first. I'd almost forgotten the gentle rhythm of needle through cloth. But as each stitch found its place, I felt a warmth spread through me, as though I were stitching my courage back into my soul. That little star wasn't much, but to me, it became a promise that I would find a way back to my family, that I would not let the darkness swallow me whole. Later that afternoon, Mrs. Jenkins's familiar voice drifted through the window I'd managed to wedge slightly open with a bent coat hanger. She was talking with a neighbor about the church charity sale, and she mentioned how they missed my pies, how someone ought to enter the pie baking contest and remind everyone what our real apple pie tasted like. My heart thumped so loud I was sure she'd hear it. In response, I slipped a tiny slip of paper, one of the pieces from Martha's original letter, out of my apron pocket and tucked it into the fold of the linen star. I whispered a prayer that when Mrs. Jenkins came around, she might notice my handiwork and understand that I was still here, still fighting, still believing in kindness. That small act, threading needle, hiding note, felt like the first brushstroke on a blank canvas. I realized that hope wasn't some grand firework display. It was a quiet nudge, a gentle reminder from the heart that life still had meaning. My faith in myself, so battered by fear and shame, began to mend like the fabric under my hands. I began to dream again, not of escape in some dramatic fashion, but of everyday joys, the taste of fresh-baked bread shared with my children, the comfort of a warm quilt, the soft melodies of hymns rising in morning light. And so, dear friends, that tiny star in the corner of a dusty cloth became my second chance at life. It taught me that even the smallest spark can ignite the fiercest hope, and that sometimes all it takes is the sound of a child's laughter or the memory of a well-loved recipe to remind us who we truly are. I held on to that star as I faced each new day, with cautious optimism in my heart, ready to stitch together the pieces of my world until it shone whole once more. Tell me, have you ever experienced a moment so small it almost slipped by, yet carried enough hope to light your darkest hour? Let me know down below. I'd love to hear your story. Well, butter my biscuit, I never imagined I'd stand in the light again, let alone choose it for myself. But there came a day deep inside that dusty closet when I felt the edges of my heart stir with a determination I hadn't known I possessed. I'd spent so long clinging to the memory of what was lost, my children's laughter, the soft chime of the church bell on Sunday mornings, Mama's gentle hum in the kitchen, that I'd forgotten there was still a world beyond those four cramped walls. But one morning, as the first pale glow of dawn filtered through the crack in the door, I pressed my hand against the rough wood and whispered into the dark, "This ends now." In that moment, I decided that my past, as painful as it had been, would no longer define my future. I pictured myself stepping out into the sunshine, the wind lifting my face, and I felt tears slip from my cheeks, not tears of sorrow, but of release. I picked up the small wooden rosary that I'd hidden in my shoe, the one Mama gave me on my wedding day, and I held it tight until my knuckles whitened. Then I pressed the last bead between my thumb and forefinger and said a prayer that was part plea and part promise. Let me walk out of this closet with the same faith I carried before the darkness fell. I imagined tossing that rosary into the grass once I saw my children's faces again, not because I no longer believed, but because I would live by my own strength, my own choices, no longer shackled by fear or by the man who tried to steal my voice. In my mind, I could already feel the weight lifting from my shoulders, like a thick cloak sliding off as I stepped into a freer skin. When Frank came with his usual midday meal, stale bread and a lukewarm cup of tea, I looked him in the eye through the crack and said, "I'm sorry you feel the need to hide me away, but I've made my choice." Before he could bluster or brandish his keys, I spat through the crack, "I choose life. I choose my children. I choose to be more than your prisoner." I heard him stagger, unheard of shock rattling through his steps as he nearly dropped the tray. His silence tasted sweeter than any triumph I'd dreamed of. I gathered my courage, tightened the makeshift shawl around my shoulders, and with a firm push against that old door, I stepped into the hallway for the first time in 7 long years. The light was blinding at first, so bright, it felt like I might weep again, but I held my eyes steady and took a deep breath of real air rather than the stale hush I'd grown used to. I felt my spine straighten as I walked toward the living room, where the dust motes danced in slanted sunbeams, and I let the world reawaken around me. I paused by the window where my favorite geraniums had wilted on the sill, And I whispered, I forgive you, Frank, but I will never be broken. That forgiveness wasn't for him, it was for me, to unburden my soul from the bitterness that threatened to root itself in my chest. And so, my dear friends, I chose to live. I left behind my sorrow, but carried with me the lessons of my darkest days, that hope can be as simple as a whispered promise, that courage can be born of a single decision, and that even the deepest wounds can heal when we stand tall and step into the sunlight. I didn't need a grand gesture to mark this turning point, just the quiet resolve to say, I am still here, and I will keep going. Now, tell me, what choice have you made that changed the course of your life? I'd be honored to hear how you found your own second wind. Well, butter my biscuit, I've lived long enough to see two very different versions of my world. The one I believed in when I was young, full of neighborly potlucks and porch swing laughter, and the one I endured when darkness closed in around me like a thick fog. It might seem like a simple truth, but here's what I've learned. Life doesn't owe you comfort, and kindness doesn't always come on a silver platter. Sometimes you have to craft it from the scraps. When I was that bright-eyed girl, I thought love was enough to fix any old trouble. I believed if you were sweet and giving, the world would treat you the same. Lordy, how wrong I was. I discovered that love can be twisted into a weapon by someone you trust, turning the tenderest care into control, the warmest home into a prison. Yet in the years since I forced that closet door open and walked back into the sunshine, I've borne witness to a deeper, truer kind of strength, one that doesn't depend on perfect people or ideal circumstances. I learned that resilience isn't about bouncing back to who you were, it's about moving forward into who you're meant to become. I traded my old recipe for pie for a new one, equal parts grit and grace, 2 cups of self-respect, and a generous dollop of laughter, because goodness knows a heart can't heal on solemn thoughts alone. Sometimes folks look at my silver hair and the lines around my eyes and think, she's seen it all. But they don't know the half of it. What I've seen is that each of us carries hidden battles, some fought in full daylight, some waged in the quiet of our own minds. And though it's tempting to wait for someone else to hand you the key, more often than not, you've got to find that key yourself, whether it's a single act of courage, a moment of forgiveness, or the strength to say, no more. So here's the life truth I carry now, and if there's room in your heart for it, I hope it guides you as well. When you feel trapped by circumstances or shadows from your past, don't wait for rescue. Rescue yourself. Notice the small glimmers, your child's laughter in the hallway, a neighbor's unexpected smile, the first warm beam of sunlight after a long storm, and let those moments remind you that you still belong in the world of the living. Let them be the stitches that mend your spirit and the whispers that tell you, keep going, keep loving, keep hoping. I'll tell you a secret. The sweetest days of my life came after I stepped out of that closet for good, days I never would have believed were possible when I was pressing my face to the cold wood, praying for just one friendly face. I found joy in teaching Sunday school again, in baking apple pies for the church fundraiser, and in holding my grandchildren close as I shared these stories on a quiet summer afternoon. And every time I feel fear creep back in, I remind myself that I've already survived the worst, and that this world still holds more good than harm, if only we choose to notice it. So maybe it's time for you to stop waiting for everything to be just so, and start building your own light, brick by tender brick. You don't need a grand exit strategy or a hero in shining armor. All you need is a sliver of hope, a single act of self-kindness, and the courage to say, I'm worth more than this. Carry that truth with you, and I promise you'll find your way out of the darkest places and into a life that's kinder, richer, and sweeter than you ever imagined. Well, butter my biscuit, here we are at the end of this long road together, and my heart feels both heavy with memory and light with possibility. I hope as you've walked through these moments with me, those first tremulous steps behind a locked door, the hush of lost mornings, the tiny star stitched into a scrap of linen, you felt the weight of what it means to lose yourself and then find your way back. This story isn't just about a past that tried to steal my voice. It's about the courage we carry forward into every new dawn. It's about reminding ourselves that love, real love, should lift us up and bring us home, not lock us away or leave us in the dark. And so I turn to you, my dear friend, because I believe our stories are bridges between souls. I ask you now, and how do you think true love should behave? Should it return when we call? Should it remain steadfast even in the fiercest storms? Or is there more to learn about how we give and receive our hearts? I want you to carry that question with you, to let it settle beside your own memories, the times you held tight to hope, the moments you learned that sometimes the bravest thing is to ask for help or to set yourself free. Remember, this tale isn't stuck in yesteryear like an old photograph fading at the edges. It lives in every choice we make today, in every gentle word we offer, in every boundary we honor, in every small act of self-respect. And as for that man who once held the key to my world, well, sometimes I swear I feel his gaze across a crowded room, or hear his voice in an echo on the wind, as if the years have softened him too. Maybe he remembers what he took from me, or perhaps he's forgotten the sound of my prayers in the night. I don't know for sure, and maybe that's the point, that some questions are meant to stay unanswered, humming at the back of our minds like distant church bells. So as I close the door on this chapter, I leave you with warmth in my heart and a hand outstretched across the years. May you find the love that honors your soul, the strength to speak your truth, and the grace to forgive both others and yourself when the road gets rocky. And sometimes, when the evening breeze carries a familiar whisper, I like to think he remembers, and that memory, sweet and strange, reminds me that even the darkest closets can't hold the light forever.